Hello and welcome to this podcast where we mark the 75th anniversary of the independence of Sri Lanka. 75 years ago today, on the 4th of February 1948, Sri Lanka, then known as the Dominion of Ceylon, received its independence from the British Empire. 75 years later, we want to understand the politics, the constitutional culture of Sri Lanka in the light of what happened, the creation of the modern state in 1948. To go through this, the moment of independence, the events that led up to that momentous occasion in the history of the country, the personalities, the issues that played a part in that watershed moment, I have with me today Dr. Harshan Kumarasingham of the University of Edinburgh. He is a scholar of decolonisation and the British Empire and the British Commonwealth. He has written on very many issues and countries, including on Ceylon and on India. Sri Lankan readers may be familiar with his recent book, A Political Legacy of the British Empire, Power and the Parliamentary System in Post-Colonial India and Sri Lanka. And he has written many other books, journals, articles, and edited collections in and around this period in the mid-20th century in South Asia and in Ceylon. My name is Asanga Valikala. I will be hosting this podcast and carrying this conversation with my friend and colleague Harshan, with whom I do a lot of work on constitutional history and the politics of democratization in Sri Lanka. Harshan, of course, is, as I mentioned, a colleague at the University of Edinburgh, but also a good friend. And I think that should do by way of introduction to you, Harshan. A very warm welcome to you into this podcast. But before we get on to the substance of this, we are going to talk about the moment of independence, the background to it, all of that. We are also going to talk a little bit about the institutions that were established, the issues of political culture and political interests that were at play at that point, and the way, when we look back retrospectively at that moment, what it helps tell us about the present. We are marking the 75th year of independence after a very serious economic crisis, which is not yet over. There is a sense of disillusionment and despair for a country which at the moment of independence was universally regarded as one of the great prospects as a post-colonial democracy. And as a very with very high expectations of economic development and prosperity for its people. We know, of course, the ensuing 75 years, the country went in different directions. It has never fulfilled its economic promise. There was a 30-plus year ethnic conflict, a civil war. So we are where we are. So the idea here is that looking at the historical moment of independence in the way a historian would, rather than a political scientist would or a lawyer would. The central idea behind this podcast is that history actually helps us to understand the present. The past tells us something about the present. So could I just kick off by asking you, Harshan, why is history important to understand in the present?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me, and cheers.
Cheers, indeed.
Well, I suppose I'm biased because I am an historian, but history is important not necessarily to tell us about the future, but to understand what happened in the past, especially as history is often the catalogue of mistakes and things that happened in the past, to try and avoid the pitfalls that happened before. And I suppose the temptation when we think of the issues you described in Sri Lanka in 2022, it's very tempting to think that this is a moment without parallel, and these are issues that have only come up in this context, when in fact there are roots to all of these things, and there are issues that have been part of the very much part of the currents of Sri Lankan society historically for many, many years. So history is in some ways there, in my view, to offer us lessons of what happened in the past, not necessarily what to do, but perhaps what to avoid, especially in terms of societal questions.
Now, the most obvious way, I suppose, looking at what happened in the past helps us is by reference to personalities, people, leaders, politicians, the human beings who played a role in shaping the the politics and the political future and the trajectory of the country. So in that sense, we study how various leaders throughout the past made decisions in situations similar to ours, and try to understand why they behaved as they did, why they took the decisions that they did, and what that tells us, both in terms of good things we may learn as well as cautionary tales about what we ought not to be doing. But history also is important in other ways, isn't it? In the sense of telling us a little bit about how institutions were shaped, for example. Now, nowadays, particularly around the economic the crisis that we had experienced, there had been a lot of conversation, debate in Sri Lankan society about the poverty of political culture, for example. That's a word that comes up all the time. People see venality and corruption, they see violence and thuggery and all of these things, and we seem to have a sense that our political culture has deteriorated very badly. And very often these reflections are accompanied by a sense that things were better in the past, at least in the Ceylon case, that politicians were of a higher quality, they displayed greater qualities of leadership, all of these things. Yet at the same time, they in fact created institutions and they made decisions, they set precedents, which may have contributed to where we have, ended up now. And explains many things also that happened in the period after 1948. Throughout the following decades, there have been very dramatic and not always good things that Sri Lanka has always had. So, in addition to studying, looking at, understanding people and personalities, sometimes in the jargon, this is known as historical institutionalism, right? That we can look at political or constitutional forms of the present and look at how they were in the past, and by studying these things say something valuable about the future. That institutions are important, they matter, they shape behavior, they shape outcomes. So what is your understanding of that? I mean, I know that this is an approach that you favor, that you're broadly in favor of, but can you more specifically tell us, perhaps by reference to the independence movement, what it is that, because what it was then, we had at that point of time in terms of our constitutional form, we retained the British monarchy as the head of state, we had a Governor-General and a fairly traditional Westminster system, from which we have now gone to a French style. Of course, we became a republic in 1972, and now we have a sort of presidential republic. The two seem to be totally incompatible and have no relationship to each other. But yet, I think, people who look at these things from a historical institutionalist point of view would say, no, in fact, there is a continuum.
Well, I think the common denominator of those two constitutional systems that you described, the Dominion model and the semi-presidential one, is very much an elite-driven one, where these are ones that are not derived from the people, but instead actually have become where there are particular leaders who perceive that this is best, not just for the country, but also for them.
Themselves.
And reflecting on your points about the temptation to see how things were to inform us of the present and some of the problems of the present, it's interesting to know that Ceylon was seen not just in the region, but actually more broadly across the British Empire and so on, not just at independence, but also afterwards, as the model, first the model colony, and then the model transfer of power. And the reasons why Ceylon was considered as such was because, generally speaking, there was a high level, and relatively speaking, there was in the 1940s a high level of relative prosperity. There was a high level of literacy among all levels of the population and all communities. Unlike, and this is a very important point for Ceylon's later developments, unlike almost every other part of the British Empire in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and to an extent the Caribbean, there was no violent ethnic conflict, and the leadership. So that's often a way Sri Lanka is judged by its ethnic dimension, but Ceylon was also judged when you said about the failures of leadership, and there was failures of leadership in the 1940s as well, but nonetheless, the leadership in Ceylon was seen as a loyal and responsible one that was well versed in terms of its culture, in terms of its education, in terms of its cosmopolitanism and cross-communalism, as one that was very able to take on the mantle of power in a fashion that the colonial power, the British, would find amenable and acceptable, which was not evident in every colony.
Certainly, and let's go back to some of those themes in a moment, and perhaps some of those things that you mentioned, the very model of what independent statehood meant, the theme of elitism, the reliance on dominant personalities, the way that the model itself was actually conceived, not so much indigenously, but by what the departing imperial power thought would be the kind of model that would ensure stability, prosperity for a country which would receive its independence. And all of these things I want to come back to. But let's start with the story. So the precise moment at which Ceylon receives its independence is on, as everybody knows, the 4th of February 1948. But where does the story actually begin? Where would you place? And historians, of course, periodization is a major preoccupation of your colleagues in the profession. You very often spend a lot of time disagreeing on when the story actually begins, right? For example, in this case, for some, it would probably begin in 1815 when the last Kandyan kingdom is subjugated by the British, and for some, the struggle for independence begins at that moment. For others, there are later moments. 1833, the COLEBROOK-CAMERON reforms, which establish the pioneering institutions that lead up to, creating a political elite in Sri Lanka that is capable of pursuing independence. And many more moments like that, including 1931, the Donamo Constitution, a very radical constitutional experiment in the British Empire. So insofar as 1948 is concerned, in the way that you have studied it, Harshan, where would you say it begins, and why would you say that?
Well, firstly, I would say that perhaps for those who are listening might find this interesting in terms of to try and avoid thinking of this in a contemporary sense, where there isn't a common understanding that things are done by the ballot box, there isn't an understanding that things are done via referenda or mass campaigns necessarily. So there is a disproportionate amount of focus on elites, and that's just a fact across the globe at that time. So this is Ceylon in that sense is not unusual.
This was not a period in which democracy was very widespread at all, right?
Not democracy as we would understand it.
Yeah.
And this is the same, it should be said, of the colonial power itself.
Itself, yes.
So Britain does not have the same type of democracy
That it has now.
even in 1948 compared to now. And so to your question about when this articulation or movement, even in a rarefied manner, happened, I think I would place it perhaps around 1919, when the Ceylon National Congress is founded by Sir PONNAMBALAM ARUNACHALAM, and
whose papers you have recently edited and are published in Sri Lanka.
And I would commend listeners to look at them and consult them, because they are very rich. Even if one disagrees with the statements within it, still gives a very rich idea of the culture and politics of the period, as well as how this relates to broader Ceylonese, Sri Lankan history and Sinhalese history and Tamil history and so on, as well as how it relates to Britain's. But not just him, but other members of the elite. And again, this is important to emphasize, I think, that there were the elite, which comprised of Low Country, Sinhala, Kandiyans, people from the Muslim minority, Christians, Burghers, and Ceylon Tamils. They coalesced and made this organization, seeing that there needed to be a vehicle to progress and promote the idea of greater autonomy in the Ceylonese sphere. And I use the word autonomy on purpose because it would be tempting to say that means independence, but it doesn't necessarily. But autonomy in the colonial context meant that for Arunachalam and his ilk, that meant having greater control of the affairs of Ceylon within the imperial sphere. And also taking it in a more global context, remember the First World War had also just ended. The Treaty of Versailles had just been signed, and there was and with Woodrow Wilson, the American president's articulation of the 14 points, one of which was the right to self-determination. As ever, these are things that are more honoured in the breach than in reality, but nonetheless, this progressed the idea that different communities, different countries, maybe different ethnicities, linguistic groups could make their own polity. And though this did not naturally come, this was the dissolution of some of the world's great empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Hohenzollern Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These collapsed, and these had been multinational composite empires with many different communities. So there was this idea that different ones could rise. So within that context, the British Empire, as governed from London, was also thinking of how they could manage this without dissolving their own empire. So, and this is something that people like Arunachalam and people like Sir James Pearce and others were very astute to pick up on, and how this could be worked to their advantage about getting greater control for Ceylonese over Ceylonese affairs.
So now, in the way that you're describing the personalities involved and the claims that they make, and the formation of the Ceylon National Congress, which then over time goes on to become the vehicle of elite opinion, of Ceylon elite opinion, for the purposes of making representations to the imperial power, to the metropolitan power. So there seems to be three things that are important. One, of course, is the obvious one about the sort of elite nature, very highly educated, very wealthy people. And it is not therefore very surprising that their preferred means of conducting politics was a very incremental, gradualist, very constitutional approach, right? So that's one of the things that I take away from what you just said. Not for them violence and radicalism, but almost a sort of application, perhaps, of the liberal principles that they may have imbibed in their own education. Many of them educated in Oxford and Cambridge, at the Inns of Court, and so on. So a very constitutional and very British means of pursuing their claims. The second thing that is, I think, important to emphasize from what you said was this idea of autonomy rather than independence, because nowadays we tend to think that these leaders were pursuing independent statehood in the way that we will understand it in the 21st century. That was not the point. The point was about greater control by Ceylonese over Ceylonese affairs, but within the rubric of remaining within the British Empire. And the third point for me was this, and that is that which is embedded in the idea, which is there in the name of the organization itself, the Ceylon National Congress. And of course, as we know, the Ceylon National Congress was not only a conglomeration of elite personalities, but also a number of groups which previously had been, associated with economic interests or ethnic interests or religious interests and so on. But with the formation and with ARUNACHALAM's papers, when you edited and published them recently, Harshan, and I was reading both your introduction and some of the papers, it was very clear to me that he has a very clear conception that one of the things that we had to do at that point in Ceylon was to unify the various ethnic and religious groups, and perhaps even the class groups, because that was also a major cleavage, into something, a composite united whole called Ceylon and the Ceylonese. Right? This is a very modern idea that while you may have your cultural identity and your language, which is based on your language or your religion or whatever, the way forward and the most persuasive claim that you could make to the British with regard to self-government or greater autonomy was if we made those claims as Ceylonese rather than as simply as Sinhalese or Kandians or Tamils or Moors or whatever it might, Burghers or whatever it might be. Now, can you reflect a little bit more about this third point? To what extent was the Congress formed in 1919 successful in constructing out of this sort of really rich hodgepodge of ethnic and religious diversity a composite nation or notion of a Ceylonese identity that transcends all of that?
Well, it's interesting, I suppose, that the ARUNACHALAM in his writings and speeches, along with others of that period, including, for example, someone who does change his politics rather markedly, the one and only S.W.R.D. BANDARANAIKE. And these two gentlemen, in some ways, although of different generations, in some ways have a very sophisticated understanding of these matters. And because while I agree that they are trying to think of a Ceylonese polity, it's important to emphasize, I think, two things. Firstly is they are not some just meekly copying what the British system is or what Britain says should be done. That is not happening. And the other thing is they are not in any way in their articulations and their politics and their thinking under the delusion that suddenly you could have overnight a new Ceylonese polity. So they're very alive to the distinctions of, say, as the Akandian culture and of a Moorish one or a
Jaffna Tamil one.
So they're alive to these things, but they say together that there is much in common, that they can work together, and that these groups and communities should work together and be represented collectively in the system. And they see, so someone like ARUNACHALAM and many like him, for example, were subscribers to Gladstonian liberalism. So it saw the idea that the state could be the vehicle of improving the lives of the many. But coming to your point of how successful they were, which is in some ways a less idealized picture, since jumping ahead, they fail. And not long after the Ceylon National Congress comes into being with a Tamil president
in
Arunachalam, they actually start dividing along ethnic lines, because there's the idea coming to the instruments of democracy and what this means, that should there be separate seats for minorities, should there be formalized representation for different groups and so on, or should there be, as in Britain at the time, having a majoritarian system, whoever wins the most wins. And as figures like ARUNACHALAM, but not just him, others, and including groups like the Kandians actually as well, so it's not just a Tamil thing, saw that this would mean the dominance of smaller groups by bigger groups, which some could argue is a inevitable aspect of full democracy.
Yeah. Now, skipping slightly about a decade ahead, and we come to the Ceylon National Congress has been formed. There are all these moments of unity, but as well as disunity. And during which period we go through a lot of experimentation with representation. The different proportions of numbers of ethnic representation in the Legislative Council, for example, undergo a lot of changes during the 1920s and so on, until there's this great moment between 1928 and 29, when there is a constitutional commission headed by is it Earl Donamo or Earl of Donamo? Earl of Donamo. Is sent to Ceylon.
An Irish peer.
An Irish peer with a Scottish, Dr. Drummond Shields, who's a Scottish, was he a trade unionist or was he a political scientist?
I can't remember.
Yes, but you and I have actually visited his grave here in Edinburgh, which is in the Grange cemetery actually, and he was for a long time a member of Parliament for one of the Edinburgh seats. A number of other distinguished people, and the really interesting context to for the sending of the Donamo Commission to Ceylon is in some ways the big change in UK politics. This is a constitutional commission sent to report on the government of the Crown Colony of Ceylon by a Labour government, something that had not happened ever before. The Labour Party had just come into being earlier in the century. 1928 was the occasion on which even women got franchise, full adult franchise was granted here in the UK. And it was a Labour government that sent this commission. And that is important to the extent that the Secretary of State for Colonies, Lord Parsfield, also known as Sidney Webb, was a great socialist intellectual, a founding father of the Labour movement and the Labour Party. And they had very distinctive, not very unconservative views, right, about how to run the empire. I mean, they were certainly not about the dissolution of empire, but they had very progressive views about Britain's role in how constitutionally colonies should evolve so that one day, eventually, people under imperial rule should be able to govern themselves. Can you tell us a little bit about the Dominion Commission and then what is known as the Dominion Constitution, which eventually came into being in 1931? What was its form and what was it meant to achieve? And again, this theme of, when you read the Dominion report, this idea of building a Ceylonese identity is something that is very prominent.
Indeed, and one of the feelings and articulated through the pages of the report was that it saw, for example, communalism as a canker on the body politic of Ceylon. And this was a view shared by many progressives in the Ceylonese political firmament. And they saw that relying on things like ethnicity, caste, religion, atavistic customs and so on was nothing more than parochialism and was inimical to a modern democracy and polity. Therefore, the Dominion Commission, although Dominion himself, going back to early points, was not a Labour peer himself, but nonetheless saw that the way for Ceylon to move forward to create this Ceylonese polity, pan-Ceylonese polity, was to abolish ethnic representation, which had been in existence since, as you mentioned earlier, since 1833, where there had been the Tamil member or the Kandyan member or the Burgher member and so on. And often these were the preserve of certain families rather than being of open competition. These were appointed. So this was to do away with that scheme, which it must say much of the elite were not very impressed that this would be going. And instead, rather than moving actually to parliamentary democracy as practiced in Westminster, instead it was to have a very unusual system, which was one of, in some ways, based on the London County Council of the time, of having ministries where the ministries almost acted separate to the other ministers as well as to the legislature. So it was an unusual system, and historians and political scientists have argued that, or some have argued that, despite the noble aims of it, it actually retarded the growth of national consciousness because Ceylonese national consciousness, because it did not encourage the existence of political parties, and was not really reflective of the realities of Ceylonese society.
But it
also did establish universal suffrage, which was one of the first. It was the first non-white colony in the British Empire to have that, and that was part of that was seeing that Ceylon was seen as a particularly, to use the parlance of the time, mature colony.
And interestingly, nobody in this Ceylon National Congress wanted it.
Very few. It was not something that was wanted. I mean, for example, to the extent where ARUNACHALAM's brother, Sir PONNAMBALAM Ramanathan, was utterly against the idea of democracy, as understood by, even at the time, because he didn't see that people who were deeply uneducated and deeply low in his terms were worthy of the responsibility of being able to vote someone as high and mighty as himself.
Yes, that's about as diplomatically close as to the language that he used, I think, that we can get nowadays. Ramanathan was very different from his brother, wasn't he? He was much more kind of reactionary, conservative, and unapologetic defender of the caste system and of elitism and of the role of educated, wealthy people to men like him to lead rather than be led by others. But a prominent Ceylonese voice was the trade unionist A.E. Gunasinghe, who did support universal franchise. But the Dominion Commission obviously made the decision to introduce universal franchise only 3 years after universal franchise becoming a reality, even in the United Kingdom, in the UK. So this was very radical. So we moved from what was known as communal or ethnic representation to territorial representation, whereby a legislature was elected in open competition at elections through representatives in a very similar way that we understand how Parliament is elected these days. And then, of course, how it functioned was that the whole legislature was then divided into a series of committees, the chairs of which constituted together a board of ministers. The board of ministers shared executive power with the governor and the three chief officials of the state, the chief secretary, the legal secretary, and the financial secretary, who were British civil servants. So it was sometimes called a diarchy or a duopoly, in the sense that the executive governance of the country was shared between a still fairly powerful governor and the three British officials, but a substantial amount of power actually did pass not only to the Ceylonese, but also to Ceylonese who were elected by the people. Now, in 1931, as you mentioned, the first non-white colony to have this kind of system, the first democracy in Asia. This is pretty radical stuff, and the whole sort of the more utopian ideas underpinning this kind of institutional structure, I suppose, in the eyes of the Dominion commissioners, was that this would be a kind of laboratory for a leadership class to grow, and for political competition, for democratic competition to get organized along ideological party lines. So they observed the absence of a party system, but they thought the system will create a party system, which it did not, as you rightly pointed out. In fact, what it did was that political mobilization under these conditions actually led to political leaders in fact appealing to ethnic and religious identities of their constituents. And as a result, rather than a party political system based on ideology or principles or policies forming, what it actually did was to create leaders who obtained power by in fact appealing to the ethnic and the religious sort of identities of their constituencies. So the Dominion Commission, in terms of its main objective, in that sense, failed, I suppose.
But I would think it's not just the Dominion commissioners that fail. Rather sadly, in my view, it's also in some ways the vision of people like ARUNACHALAM also fails. Because this 1930s is and 1940s are a deceptive period, where outwardly it seems that things are going very well. There's relative peace, there's relative prosperity, there's relative development, and yet there, as you say, is a failure in terms of being able to form a cohesive, long-lasting sense of who Ceylonese are beyond an ethnic or religious dimension.
So it seems to me that, there are certain things that are constant between then and now, and some things that have changed. So one thing that seems to be very constant is the fact that one of the most powerful means of mobilizing people to vote for one person or the other in Sri Lanka remains then as now the appeals made on ethnic and religious identities. I am Sinhalese, I am Buddhist, vote for me, I will look after your interest. Harshan, you are Tamil and Hindu, and you go to your people and say the same thing, and then you are voted in by those people to represent those interests. And then you and I, at best, hammer out a compromise or negotiated settlement for our competing constituencies, or at worst, we start fighting on behalf of them. Right? But what is fairly distinctively different between then and now is unquestionably that we have discussed a number of people, the ARUNACHALAM, the PONNAMBALAM brothers, Sir Marcus Fernando, many others of that period, who were clearly highly educated, extremely urban, well-read, literate, cultured people. Now, even if a leadership of that caliber and character could not transcend, even though they knew that they had to do it, but could not transcend the power of ethnicity and religion in the creation of a civic Sri Lankan identity, in the creation of ideology rather than ethnicity-based parties, etc. And now I don't think it's a particularly controversial thing to say that when you look at the political elites now in contemporary Sri Lanka, we have nothing like what that was.
No.
So in that sense, then we are in a far worse position because then we had educated people who at least knew what the national interest was but were unable to transcend the power of ethnicity and religion. Now we just don't have people who even understand that.
Well, indeed. It's also, I suppose, one thing, and that's, I suppose, that element is that what has stayed the same there was the arrogance of the particular leaders that they nonetheless thought that they could do what they were doing.
They thought they could do two things. One is at election time go and appeal to the people on these grounds, but then when they were elected, that they thought that they could play accommodationist politics between themselves within the elite.
And as we'll see, especially this comes to play, especially after 1948, but in the period up to, there is this hope that things can be managed enough. And in some ways, despite the introduction of universal suffrage and these new institutions of local government and Ceylon-wide government, there isn't, unlike India, a existence of a wide polity on a mass sense that you see in especially with Gandhi from the late 1920s. So this is not happening in Ceylon.
But Ceylon doesn't do Gandhi style stuff.
No,
do we?
not
I
at
mean,
all.
our elites are not interested in that type of stuff.
No, I mean but because they weren't into that stuff, and we can argue for the reasons whether they why or why not, but because they didn't really take too much effort to try and take their message beyond the rarefied environment of cinnamon gardens, that they did not really push their message, which in many cases was sincerely felt, that they were doing their best for the country and they wanted to go beyond the archaic parochialisms of religion, ethnicity, caste and so on. But they didn't really take too much effort to try and push that message beyond the English-speaking classes, or, as I said, beyond a few suburbs in Colombo. So they didn't take it to the regions. They did not take it to the people. It was not in the schools. It was something that was almost left unsaid.
Yep. And the preserve of a kind of the intellectual section of the political.
Even though all of those people that we've mentioned and many, many others like F.R. Senanaika, mentioned Sir James Pearce, indeed, they were all these were not, it should be emphasized time and again, these are not colonial lackeys.
Yeah.
These were people that were not only very fortunate to be educated often abroad, but if not abroad, very well in Sri Lanka itself, but were also very much aware of the richness of their own civilizations and histories and of their own cultures. These were not people rejecting their own backgrounds or pretending or ashamed of it in any sense. These are people very proud of their background,
right?
And their potential.
Sure. So Sinhalese and Tamils, to mention only the two major communities, were very conscious of their history. They're very proud, very ancient histories, their language, literature, all of these things. Yet at the same time, through their education and acculturation through their education and perhaps their experiences in living and studying in the UK, who also had absorbed constitutional and political ideas of 19th century liberalism. And for them, these two things were perhaps not that much of a contradiction. That it was possible to be both. It was possible to be very proudly an Asian, desiring a greater control over their own affairs. Yet at the same time, they probably were also of the view that to use a modernism, a rules-based order within which they were autonomous. And they were also sort of imbibers in that sense, weren't they, of British culture, not only political ideas, but also of literature and so on. So this was an elite that was very much kind of syncretic. They lived in two cultural worlds at the same time.
Well, I mean, it also should, I think, be added that these were these men, and they were predominantly men, were not picked out of obscurity. These were the natural leaders in their traditional societies. These were not handpicked by the British out of obscurity. These were people who would, in the pre-colonial times, very likely would be at the top of the tree in their particular communities and so on. So they saw interest, obviously, in preserving their leadership in perpetuity.
Absolutely.
Using modern norms.
Right. Returning to the sort of chronological story, now we come to the end of the 1930s, and of course the major event is the outbreak of the Second World War, 1938-39, and then across the empire, local leaders have to decide which side, what is it going to be. And of course, in the settler dominions, which was largely peopled by at least the most important people in those countries, by which time were people who had actually emigrated out of the UK, had kith and kin connections to the mother country, as they called it. And for them, of course, there was no question. It was absolute loyalty to king and empire and the country in the fight against the Nazis. But it was a little bit more complicated, I think, for the Asians and the Africans. And within South Asia, you see nationalist leaders going in several different directions. In India, certainly the support for imperialism, certainly at least among the leadership, is lukewarm at best. Some, in fact, actually make common cause with the Axis and so on, but not so in Ceylon. There is a very powerful leftist critique, of course, of British imperialism and all of that, but Yet at the same time, the left has no truck with fascism or with Hitler or with any of those things. But the dominant section of the elite become very much a very loyal ally of the Allied war effort against fascism in the late 30s, early 40s. Nevertheless, though, this is also the context, and in our next episode, we want to now go into, this is the moment at which the sort of the demand for independence and the train of events which eventually leads to 4th February 1940, it actually starts happening, which is when the Ceylon National Congress adopts independence as its official policy to demand that of His Majesty's government. And then there is a process that follows from then on, leading up to independence. So in our next session, let's discuss both what those events were in chronological order. I think we have all forgotten many of these things, except for historians like you, Harshan, who actually study that period in very great detail. So I think it's important to remember how it happened, what happened. And very importantly, I want to also talk to you about the leaders. There were very prominent people who played a decisive role in all of this, on all of whom you have done a lot of work or continuing to do work. And so let's look at the events as well as the personalities concerned when we meet again. Thank you.